The UK just spent 86.5 million on hydrogen. Not to produce hydrogen, but to build machines that currently have nowhere to go. That's the part they don't put in the press release. And that gap between what this investment is described as and what it actually is where the real story begins. There's a factory being built in Sheffield. Clean walls, automated arms, precision assembly lines producing membrane stacks with the care you'd give something expensive and fragile. Because that's exactly what they are. Workers in lab coats, clean rooms, the infrastructure of serious industrial ambition. Outside, government ministers talk about clean energy sovereignty. A stock price jumps 11% in a single morning. Ed Miliband calls it the clean energy mission in action. Rebuilding energy security. Good industrial jobs for South Yorkshire. By every measure the camera can reach, this looks like a breakthrough. But here's what experienced investigators know about energy stories. The breakthrough is almost never where they point the camera, so let's point it somewhere else. The company is ITM Power. Founded in 2000, listed on the AIM market in 2004. Their product is electrolysers, systems that use electricity and water to produce green hydrogen through electrolysis. The government funding breaks down as $46.5 million in direct grants from the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, plus $40 million from GB Energy, Britain's state-owned clean energy company, in exchange for a 10.4% equity stake. The money goes toward a new automated manufacturing line for ITM Power's next-generation Kronos electrolyser stack. 1 gigawatt of annual capacity, operational target 2028. Now, let's be precise about what this actually is. This is not a hydrogen plant. Hydrogen will not flow out of Sheffield in 2028. What Sheffield will produce is the machines that could, elsewhere, if conditions are right, produce hydrogen. That distinction sounds administrative. It is not. It is the entire story. Because the government isn't funding energy production, it's funding equipment manufacturing. And those two things operate under completely different economic logic, face completely different risks, and fail for completely different reasons. On paper, this should work. Cheaper machines, better efficiency, more manufacturing scale, that should mean cheaper hydrogen, lower barriers, faster deployment. But it doesn't. Not automatically, not linearly, not without something else being in place first. And that's where this story stops being about engineering and starts becoming something else entirely. An electrolyzer is an elegant piece of engineering, a stack of electrochemical cells. Feed it electricity and water, split the molecules, hydrogen out one side, oxygen out the other. ITM Power's proton exchange membrane technology is particularly well suited to variable renewable power, which makes it theoretically well matched to the intermittent nature of wind and solar. Theoretically, here's what an electrolyzer cannot do. It cannot create its own operating conditions. It cannot guarantee the electricity feeding it is cheap enough to make the hydrogen economically viable. It cannot secure offtake contracts. It cannot fix grid connection delays. It cannot hold a power price steady when the market moves against it. An electrolyzer performs brilliantly when everything around it cooperates. And in the real world, everything around it frequently does not cooperate. That should have been enough to redirect attention. The machine problem was solvable, we solved it. But the projects kept failing anyway. And when you ask why, when you actually follow the money backward through the projects that never reached final investment decision, the plants that were permitted but never built, the hydrogen that was modeled but never produced, you find the same variable again and again. Utilization. Utilization is the percentage of time a piece of industrial equipment actually runs versus how long it theoretically could. In hydrogen economics, it is arguably the single most important number in determining whether a project lives or dies. And it is almost never what the headline focuses on. Here's why it matters so much. The cost of producing green hydrogen is dominated by two factors: the cost of electricity consumed and the amortized cost of equipment spread over its operational lifetime. Spend $50 million on an electrolyzer system running at 80% annual utilization, and you spread that capital cost across an enormous volume of hydrogen. Drop to 40% utilization and your cost per kilogram roughly doubles. Before you've changed a single component, before the electricity price has moved, before anything technically has gone wrong. The models behind most green hydrogen projects assume utilization of 60 to 80%. That means electrolyzers running almost continuously, fed by cheap, consistent, renewable electricity, selling output to committed buyers at agreed prices. In reality, many projects struggle to reach half that. Somewhere in the UK right now, a hydrogen project is fully permitted. The planning approvals came through, the equipment is specified, the engineers are ready. And the project is completely idle, waiting for a grid connection that the queue says won't arrive for years. The infrastructure assumes the grid will be there. The grid wasn't consulted. That's not an edge case, that's a pattern. Renewable power fluctuates in ways that operational models underestimate. Grid connection queues stretch to a decade in some regions. Electricity prices spike at the exact moments when running an electrolyser makes the least economic sense. And offtake. The fundamental question of who actually buys the hydrogen, at what price, under what contractual terms, remains the industry's most stubborn, most structurally important, most consistently underestimated problem. Without long-term, bankable offtake agreements, project financing collapses. Without project financing, electrolysers don't get installed. Without installed electrolysers in real operating projects, the Sheffield factory's future customers don't materialize. The whole chain freezes. Not because the technology doesn't work, but because the system around it never delivered the conditions it was modeled on. That should feel uncomfortable because it means the risk isn't where the investment is. Now zoom out further. Because this isn't just a UK story. Electrolyser manufacturing capacity is scaling across the world. Gigawatt-scale factories are in development in Europe, the United States, China, Australia. The equipment side of the hydrogen industry is accelerating. Globally, planned electrolyser manufacturing capacity already runs into the tens of gigawatts. Actual installed green hydrogen capacity? Projects genuinely operational, producing hydrogen consistently with real off-takers and real economics, is measured in the low single-digit gigawatts. The ratio between what the industry can build and what it has deployed is not close. That gap is not a rounding error, it is the story. This gap is not a temporary lag that will resolve itself as the industry matures. It reflects a structural mismatch in sequencing. The industry is moving faster on what it can control: equipment costs, manufacturing efficiency, electrolyser performance, than on what is harder to control: grid infrastructure, policy frameworks that make offtake bankable, demand signals strong enough to justify long-term contracts. ITM Power knows this dynamic better than most. Despite posting record turnover for 2 consecutive years, the company reported a $45 million annual loss as recently as August 2025. Revenue is growing. Profitability remains out of reach. The business has commercial momentum without commercial sustainability. And that gap is a precise reflection of the broader industry condition. The government investment improves the picture materially, lifting ITM Power's expected year-end cash balance to between $210 and $215 million. But cash position and commercial viability are different instruments. One extends the runway, the other requires the market to arrive. So why is the government doing this? That question has a real answer, but it's not the answer in the press release. Ed Miliband framed this in energy terms: clean power, net zero, energy sovereignty. Those motivations are genuine. The UK has legal climate commitments and a governing identity increasingly staked on clean energy leadership. But the structural logic of the investment is industrial, not energetic. The UK is not primarily betting that green hydrogen immediately works at scale. It is betting that if hydrogen works at scale, Britain should own a meaningful position in the global supply chain that makes it possible. Manufacturing electrolysers is a strategic foothold. It creates skilled industrial jobs in a region, South Yorkshire, where such jobs carry both economic and political weight. It builds sovereign capability in a technology that may become critical. It keeps Britain inside a global race where the US Inflation Reduction Act and European industrial policy are both competing aggressively for clean technology manufacturing. Even if the hydrogen market takes a decade to reach the scale that optimists project, the UK calculates it's better to hold a supply chain position than to be buying equipment from overseas when demand eventually arrives. That is a defensible calculation. It is also a bet on future positioning rather than present economics. And bets on future positioning require the future to cooperate, which brings us to what actually determines whether it does. The projects that succeed in hydrogen, the ones that will absorb manufacturing capacity coming out of Sheffield and factories like it, do not succeed because they have the most efficient electrolysers. Technology is not the differentiating variable. What separates the projects that get built and operate at scale from the ones that stall is the configuration of 4 things that have nothing to do with stack design. 4 things decide whether a hydrogen project survives, not technology. System conditions, power, offtake, utilization, financing. Projects that solve these 4 in combination get financed and built. Projects that don't, regardless of how advanced or cost-effective their electrolyzers are, do not. The bottleneck is not in the machine. It never was. And this is where things get uncomfortable. Because the entire momentum of the industry, the investment cycles, the government programs, the manufacturing scale-up, the press conferences, is concentrated on the variable that is already largely solved. Electrolyzer costs have fallen dramatically. Efficiency has improved. The engineering is at the level required for most projects, no longer the binding constraint. But the binding constraints, grid infrastructure that can deliver consistent, affordable power, policy architecture that makes offtake contracts financeable, demand signals strong enough to justify long-term commitment, these move slowly. They require coordination across governments, utilities, industrial users, and capital markets. They can't be solved in a clean room. They can't be announced at a press conference. And they are not, in most countries, moving at anything close to the pace of the manufacturing pipeline building up behind them. The machines are being built before the system that makes them viable is operational. In energy, that order matters more than almost anything else, so where does this go? By 2028, the Sheffield facility is operational. The Kronos line is producing 1 gigawatt of electrolyzer capacity annually. Equipment costs continue falling. Chinese competition intensifies. The global electrolyzer market becomes simultaneously more efficient and more brutal. A subset of hydrogen projects get built. The ones with the strongest power positions, the most committed industrial off-takers, the closest proximity to existing hydrogen demand, these reach final investment decision. They operate at meaningful utilization. They prove the economics. They become the reference cases the industry has been waiting for. A larger number of projects stall, quietly, without announcements. Projects conceived when capital was cheaper, when grid connections were assumed rather than secured, when offtake was modeled rather than contracted. These don't make it. They get delayed indefinitely or shelved without fanfare. The equipment they would have ordered stays in Sheffield. And if that second group is large enough, if the deployment gap widens instead of narrows, then the factories themselves face the same problem they were built to solve. A manufacturing line producing equipment that the market cannot yet absorb is not an energy success story. It is a supply chain waiting for a demand signal that hasn't arrived. What happens if it fails? Not catastrophically, not immediately, but structurally, gradually, in the way that industrial bets gone wrong tend to unfold. The factory operates below capacity. Margins compress. The strategic position the UK bought is worth less than projected because the market it was positioned for moved slower than assumed. The jobs are real but fewer than promised. The technology is proven but the economics remain stuck. That is the stakes, not collapse, but drift. The slow divergence between ambition and outcome that characterizes most large industrial transitions, not because the technology was wrong, but because the system it depended on wasn't ready. So the question isn't whether the Sheffield factory will work, it will. The question is, will the system arrive in time to use what it produces? The UK is building hydrogen factories. The machines will work. The engineering is already solved. But until the system works, until power is consistent, offtake is contracted, utilization is real, those machines don't produce energy. They produce potential, and an energy potential doesn't get financed. The camera is pointed at the factory in Sheffield. The story is in the system underneath it, in the grid queues and offtake negotiations and utilization spreadsheets that no press release mentions and no stock price reflects. Understanding that gap is the difference between watching the energy transition and understanding it. And that understanding, not the machines, not the factories, not the funding announcements, is what determines whether any of this actually works. If you want to go deeper into how these systems actually work, from energy balances to project viability, explore more at Renee Energy.